Welcome to Eureka. Today, we're taking a deep dive into content and language-integrated learning. Think about how much the world has shrunk, right?
Definitely.
Being able to navigate different languages isn't just a bonus anymore. It's increasingly, well, the norm.
hmm
And when you look at a place like Asia with its incredible mosaic of languages, education faces a really interesting challenge and an opportunity too.
Absolutely.
We're diving into a fascinating approach today. CLIL, that's Content and Language Integrated Learning.
Exactly. And at its heart, CLIL is about learning a subject, say science or maths, through another language.
Okay.
And in many Asian contexts, that language is usually English. It's a really elegant idea when you think about it.
How so?
Well, you're not just passively absorbing facts about maybe climate change. You're also actively building your English vocabulary, your communication skills, as you grapple with the concepts.
I see. So it's learning through the language.
Precisely. It's a pedagogical approach with a lot of potential.
Okay, so this idea of CLIL,
Hmm.
where did the spark for it come from? Was it an Asian thing originally?
Actually, no. The concept really began to take shape in Europe back in the 1990s.
Oh, okay.
People like David Marsh were really instrumental. He helped define CLIL as this sort of umbrella term, this overarching idea of using language as the vehicle for teaching subject content.
Right.
Then you have the 4Cs framework, developed by Coyle, Hood, and Marsh. That gave a more structured way of thinking about it.
The 4Cs, what are those?
They emphasize the crucial links between content, communication, cognition, and culture.
So it's definitely more than just translating the history textbook into English then.
Oh, absolutely, much more. The 4Cs highlight that you're dealing with the actual subject matter. That's content.
Got it.
Then the specific language needed to understand and talk about it, communication.
Okay.
The thinking processes involved in learning, analyzing, problem solving, that's cognition.
Right, the higher order stuff.
Exactly. And also gaining a broader understanding of different worldviews that language can unlock. That's culture.
Wow, okay. Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine a history lesson on the Silk Road. That's the content.
Okay.
But students also discuss its impact on cultural exchange using specific historical vocabulary in English that's communication.
Mm-hmm.
They might compare different accounts of the same event, that's cognition, and explore how these interactions shaped cultural identities across continents. There's your culture aspect.
That paints a much clearer picture. So how did this European concept travel east to Asia?
Well, as globalization really picked up speed, many Asian nations saw this growing need, right, to equip their students with strong English skills and a more international outlook.
Makes sense.
And CLIL looked like a really promising way to achieve both. Enhance English proficiency while fostering a deeper understanding of the subject matter, preparing students for a more interconnected world.
So we started seeing experiments.
Yeah, definitely. We've seen various experiments with it in places like Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, China.
Yeah.
Quite a few places have dipped their toes in.
So our goal for this deep dive is to really get under the hood of CLIL, understand its core principles,
Right.
then look at how it's actually been implemented in Asia. Particularly, I think, looking at the contrasting journeys of Hong Kong and Singapore sounds fascinating.
It really is a tale of two cities in some ways.
And then figure out some key strategies for successful adoption. And we're doing this using some brand new research that just came out this month, May 2025.
Exactly. It gives us a really fresh perspective. So let's dig into the fundamentals of CLIL a bit more. As we said, it's learning a subject through another language, English often in Asia.
And the key is that dual focus.
That's the crucial aspect, the simultaneous focus on both linguistic growth and developing your understanding of the subject matter. Coyle and her colleagues really hammered this home back in 2010.
And the 4Cs framework is central to making that happen, isn't it?
Absolutely. You can't just, immerse students in content delivered in another language and just hope language learning happens by magic.
Great, it needs structure.
It does. Communication is about identifying and using the specific language students need to interact with the subject. The keywords, the grammar, how to phrase ideas.
Okay.
Cognition is about pushing students to think, critically analyze, problem solve, evaluate, all while working in the new language. That's demanding.
I bet.
And culture brings in that essential element of understanding different viewpoints and contexts. Language really opens that door.
You also mentioned Cummins BICS and CLLP earlier. How do they fit into the CLIL picture?
Yes. That's a really important distinction. BICS, basic interpersonal communicative skills, that's your Everyday social language, playground chat, basically.
Okay, the easy stuff.
Right, relatively, yes.
Yeah.
But CLLP, Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, that's the more complex, abstract language needed for academic learning. The language of textbooks, lectures, essays.
Right. Much harder.
Much harder. And CLIL is specifically designed to cultivate that CLOP by embedding academic language within the context of learning subjects like science or history.
So it's intentionally building that deeper academic language, not just conversational fluency.
Precisely. And it aligns really nicely with other big educational theories. Think about Vygotsky, his zone of proximal development.
The ZPD, yeah. What you can do with help.
Exactly. CLIL provides that guided interaction, that scaffolding in the language, helping learners achieve more linguistically and cognitively than they could on their own, like a teacher helping you play a harder piece of music.
Okay.
And Bloom's taxonomy, too. CLIL encourages those higher-order thinking skills, analysis, evaluation, creation, through challenging tasks in the target language. It pushes students beyond just remembering facts.
So it's a very deliberate, structured approach. How is it different from just, say, teaching all subjects in English, which some schools do? EMI, right?
Right, EMI. English is a medium of instruction. That's where the nuances are really key. EMI often just uses English to deliver the curriculum content.
Without the language focus.
Often without that explicit focus on language learning strategies, yeah. Teachers might not be specifically trained to help students unpack the academic language they're encountering.
I see.
Then you have language across the curriculum. That integrates language skills into different subjects. But the main goal isn't necessarily the systematic development of a second language.
Okay.
And bilingual education often involves teaching content in two languages separately, maybe parallel classes.
Yeah.
CLIL emphasizes learning the content through the additional language. The language is the tool for learning the content.
Got it. So the language learning is an explicit and integrated goal within the subject teaching in CLIL. What are the big upsides? What are the benefits people point to?
Well, research points to some pretty significant advantages. Dalton Puffer's work, for instance, highlighted enhanced overall language proficiency.
Makes sense.
Bialystok's research suggested it can boost cognitive flexibility, that mental agility, switching between tasks and ways of thinking. Mhisto and colleagues found increased student motivation. And naturally, CLIL can foster greater intercultural awareness as students engage with content and perspectives from different cultures through the language itself.
It sounds fantastic on paper, almost like a silver bullet.
Nah.
But what are the real-world obstacles? Where does it get tricky when schools actually try to do CLIL?
Oh, there are definitely considerable hurdles, big ones. One of the most significant, something Costin D'Angelo noted way back in 2011, is the lack of teachers.
Lack of teachers.
Specifically, teachers who are proficient both in their subject area and in effective CLIL teaching methods. That's a tall order.
Finding that combination must be tough.
It really is. Then you have the challenge of curriculum alignment, making sure the content goals and the language goals actually mesh well together.
Okay.
Assessment gets way more complex. How do you fairly evaluate progress in both subject understanding and language skills?
Good question.
And just finding or developing the right teaching materials, stuff that's relevant locally and actually supports the language learning effectively alongside the content. That can be a major undertaking.
Right, you can't just use any old textbook. Let's focus now on how this has actually played out in Asia, starting with Hong Kong. You mentioned them earlier.
Yes, Hong Kong. The Education Bureau's fine-tuning of MOI policy in 2010 was a really important moment, MOI being medium of instruction.
Okay.
Now, they didn't explicitly mandate CLIL everywhere, but this policy definitely led to more schools using English to teach subjects other than English itself, often with some government support.
So schools started experimenting?
Some did, yes. Certain schools, like Hulap College was one example, experimented with project-based learning approaches that definitely incorporated CLIL principles, even if they didn't always call it that.
And what were the initial results? Did it look promising?
Well, research by Low and Lin around 2015 indicated some encouraging early signs, particularly with student motivation. Yeah, students seemed more motivated, more willing to actually use English in the classroom. There seemed to be an initial buzz, you know?
But as we kind of hinted, CLIL didn't really become this widespread success story in Hong Kong. What went wrong? Why didn't it stick?
This is where it gets really insightful. The recent research, including the May 2025 papers we looked at, suggests it wasn't that the idea of CLIL was flawed.
Okay.
It was the implementation. It's widely seen now as having been, well, pretty poorly managed.
Mismanaged implementation, not failed pedagogy.
Exactly. A significant number of schools actually abandoned their CLIL initiatives after a while. The two biggest stumbling blocks seem to have been teacher readiness and, maybe unsurprisingly, the enormous pressure from the examination system.
Teacher readiness keeps coming up. What were the specific problems for teachers in Hong Kong trying to do this?
The Revitalizing CLIL in Hong Kong paper really digs into this. A central issue was just not enough collaboration or training.
Collaboration between who?
Between the content teachers, the science teacher, the history teacher, the English language teachers. The traditional school structure in Hong Kong often has these very separate, distinct subject departments. Silos, basically.
Ah, right.
So they rarely had structured time or opportunities to plan lessons together, or maybe co-teach, or even figure out how to assess student work jointly.
Logistical barriers.
Huge ones. Time constraints, lack of real incentives for doing that cross-disciplinary work, and often just a limited understanding between teachers from different fields. Young's 2023 study highlighted this. Teachers felt isolated. No real framework for shared planning.
Even if they wanted to, it was hard.
Exactly. And even when professional development was offered, it was often just these one-off workshops.
Yeah.
Not the sustained, practical, in-school support teachers really needed to change their practice in such a fundamental way.
So those departmental silos really blocked the teamwork CLIL seems to need. What about the other things you mentioned, contextual and institutional challenges?
Yeah, those were really significant in Hong Kong. The curriculum itself is incredibly packed, very dense.
Okay.
And school timetables are often quite rigid, leaving little room for teachers to experiment with these more integrated, language-focused activities that take time.
Time pressure again.
And overlaid on all that is the intense pressure of high-stakes standardized testing. The DSE exams. Teachers often felt understandably forced to prioritize just covering vast amounts of content quickly, cramming it in, which left very little space for the kind of language-rich dialogue and activities that are really the heart of CLIL.
Content coverage versus language development.
Exactly. Low and Lin's 2019 research really pointed out how this exam-driven culture actively discouraged teachers from trying more integrative methods. Plus, there was a real shortage of good, locally relevant classroom materials that effectively combine language and content support.
It sounds like teachers were really caught between a rock and a hard place, trying to juggle curriculum demands and language support. What about the students? How did they react to these CLIL attempts?
Well, student responses were quite varied. And a really critical factor was their existing level of English proficiency.
That makes sense.
In a CLIL classroom, you're asking students to do two hard things at once. Understand the subject matter and process it in a second language.
Cognitive load.
Huge cognitive load. If their listening skills or their academic vocabulary in English wasn't strong enough, they could just get completely overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Lowe's research from just last year, 2024, indicated that students who had better self-regulation skills who could manage their learning process better tended to do better in CLIL settings. But for many students, the language barrier was a really significant hurdle.
You need that foundation, right, to even access the content. So what kind of language support was actually being provided to help them bridge that gap?
This was another area where the implementation often fell short. It was inconsistent.
How so?
Thung's 2019 study looking at a chemistry class showed really clearly that when teachers deliberately built in language, support things like bilingual glossaries, sentence starters for writing lab reports, visual aid students made much better progress.
So it worked when it was done intentionally?
Yes. But that kind of intentional, integrated language support wasn't happening consistently. It was often seen as like an optional extra rather than a fundamental part of teaching and learning in this model.
Why not?
Well, content teachers might not have felt trained or confident enough to identify the specific language demands of their subject or how to best scaffold that language for their students. It requires a specific skill set.
It really sounds like a disconnect, doesn't it, between the sort of high-level policy aims and the day-to-day reality in the classrooms.
Exactly that. Yang's 2017 research highlighted this gap. You had these top-down pushes towards using English more, maybe an awareness of CLIL's potential benefits, but teachers often lack the practical guidance, the resources, and crucially, the sustained professional development and support from school leadership needed to make it work.
And no real push for collaboration.
And not really a strong system of accountability that truly prioritized or rewarded that collaborative planning and interdisciplinary teaching. The incentives weren't aligned.
So Hong Kong's experience really drives home how critical getting the implementation right is. It's not enough to have a good idea.
Not at all.
Now let's pivot to Singapore. You presented that as a more successful example of large-scale CLIL adoption. What made the difference there?
Singapore offers a really compelling contrast. For decades, English has been the established medium of instruction for pretty much all content subjects, right from the early years.
A system-wide policy.
A consistent system-wide approach.
That's fine.
That's fundamental. Mother tongue languages are taught too, but as separate subjects. And the National Institute of Education, the NIE, plays a huge role. They ensure teacher training programs are aligned with this bilingual education vision. So teachers are prepared from the start to deliver content effectively through English.
Training is key.
Absolutely. Institutions like Hwa Chong Institution are often cited as examples where CLIL principles are effectively put into practice, even if they don't always explicitly use the CLIL label everywhere.
And the results?
Well, you just have to look at Singapore's consistently strong performance in international assessments like PISA. It suggests that this long-term integrated model has been largely successful in developing both content knowledge and English proficiency.
It sounds like a much more unified, long-term strategic approach compared to what happened in Hong Kong.
It certainly appears that way, much more embedded in the system.
What about those other Asian countries you mentioned briefly earlier? Japan, Korea, Vietnam, China. Any quick takeaways there?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. In Japan, the focus on EMI tends to be more at the university level. But often, as Brown and Iobi noted, without that explicit language scaffolding piece that's key to CLIL.
Just content delivery in English?
Kind of.
Oh?
South Korea has seen some CLIL initiatives, but they often seem concentrated in more elite schools or contexts. Again, the pressure of standardized testing and some teacher resistance seem to be factors, as Kim's research suggested.
Okay.
Vietnam shows growing interest, especially in higher education, for both EMI and CLIL. But they're still grappling with the implementation challenges, according to Nguyen's work.
Still early days, perhaps.
Perhaps. And in China, you definitely see bilingual and international schools adopting CLIL-like approaches quite successfully. But the national assessment system remains a big barrier to wider adoption in mainstream schools. Huyen and Adamson pointed this out.
So it really seems Singapore stands out for having a consistent system-wide approach that's yielded more broadly positive results. Thinking about Hong Kong's struggles then, what are some concrete strategies that could help them, or maybe other places facing similar roadblocks, to actually revitalize CLIL?
Well, that Revitalizing CLIL in Hong Kong paper offers some very practical suggestions, directly addressing the challenges they identified. Number 1, structured collaboration.
Getting teachers talking.
And working together, yes. Creating dedicated time and structures for content and language teachers. Co-planning, co-teaching, setting shared goals, maybe using models like lesson study where they observe and learn from each other.
Making it part of the job, not an extra.
Exactly. And professional development needs to be ongoing, job-embedded, practical, not just those one-off workshops. Maybe bringing in external experts, encouraging participation in international forums, even micro-credentials focused on bilingual pedagogy.
That makes complete sense. You can't expect teachers to pull off something this complex without real ongoing support and training. What about the curriculum itself? Does that need to change?
Yes, curriculum design needs a rethink. It needs to be intentionally adapted to create more space for language-supported inquiry and discussion.
Less focus on just covering content.
Maybe prioritizing essential questions, designing units that deliberately weave in activities to promote reading to learn and writing to think in English, not just testing recall.
And assessment.
Assessment needs to evolve, too, to capture both content understanding and language development. Maybe rubrics that assess both explicitly. More formative stuff, like reflection journals or discussion protocols, giving students different ways to show what they know, multimodally perhaps.
And having the right tools must help, right? The right resources.
Oh, absolutely. Developing centralized resource banks, places teachers can easily find high-quality bilingual glossaries, useful sentence frames for students, model texts, task templates. That kind of practical support can be invaluable.
Take some of the burden off individual teachers.
It does. And maybe starting small helps, too. Pilot programs. Try it in one grade level or one subject. Evaluate carefully, see what works in your school's context, and then scale up based on evidence.
Learn as you go.
Exactly. And finally, don't forget to celebrate successes. Share the stories of what's working through newsletters, videos, student showcases. Build that positive momentum and a school-wide appreciation for this integrated approach.
The paper even included some specific examples, didn't it, of what this might look like in a Hong Kong secondary classroom. Could you share one or two?
Sure, they're really helpful. For instance, in a secondary 2 science unit on water pollution, students could collect and analyze data, right?
Yep.
Then they'd present their findings using specific grammar like the passive voice or scientific sequencing words, and the teacher provides sentence frames to help them structure their writing or speaking.
Scaffolding the language.
Exactly. And the science teacher and an English teacher could then co-assess both the science content and the language use. Definitely. Or a maths project about planning a dim sum outing. Students analyze English menus, calculate costs, including service charges using specific maths terms and phrases in English, and then justify their choices using clear language.
Applying maths and language together.
Right. And the learning objectives on the board would clearly show both the maths goals and the language goals for the lesson.
Makes it explicit.
Yeah. Or think about economics, a product pitch simulation. Students would practice using modal verbs, should, could, and logical connectors, therefore, however, to make persuasive arguments in English, alongside creating infographics with the financial data.
Real-world skills.
Very much so. Even history students could use bilingual sources about WWII in Hong Kong, then write diary entries in English from that perspective. The teacher might do mini lessons on descriptive phrases or words to show time sequence.
Bringing history alive through language.
Precisely. And they even suggested a school-wide cross-curricular CLIL showcase week. Imagine themed lessons integrating English and content across subjects, culminating in students sharing their work. Great for visibility and parent engagement too.
Those examples really help make it concrete. It's clearly so much more than just translating stuff. It's about using the language as a genuine tool to think, to learn, to show deeper understanding.
That's exactly it. And as that revitalizing CLIL paper concludes, the initial problems in Hong Kong weren't really about CLIL itself being a bad idea.
Right.
It was about a fragmented, under-supported implementation. It really stresses that CLIL needs to be seen as a shared school-wide mission, not just dumped on the English teachers.
So wrapping this up, the key takeaways seem to be the CLIL has real potential for integrating language and content learning effectively. But as Hong Kong's experience shows so clearly, making it work really hinges on strong, sustained teacher collaboration, meaningful ongoing professional development, and real systemic support from school leaders. Get the implementation right.
Precisely. Build those collaborative structures, invest in teachers' growth, embed language support across the board. And remember, the goal isn't just perfect English fluency. It's equipping students with the language tools they need for critical thinking, for problem solving, for deeper academic engagement.
So here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. Thinking about these principles, integrating learning, breaking down silos, intentionally supporting communication, how might these ideas apply in your own world, your field, your work, even outside formal education? How can fostering collaboration and being more conscious of the language we use help us achieve deeper understanding and maybe even spark innovation? Definitely some food for thought there. Thanks for listening to Eureka.